My girlfriend left me because I worked as a mover. She said, "I'm ashamed of you, ashamed of who you are." But later, she deeply regretted it. Let me tell you how this whole mess started. So there I was, 25 years old, working as a mover in Beverly Hills. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. Another broke dude with big dreams in L.A. But hear me out. This story gets wild. I've been hauling furniture, boxes, and basically whatever rich people didn't want anymore for about 8 months. The pay wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great either. I was making just enough to cover my van payments and gas, plus maybe a burger or two from In-N-Out when I felt fancy. See, I was living in my work van, not because I was homeless or anything dramatic like that, but because I was saving every penny I could. The plan was simple: work hard, save money, eventually get a real apartment, and maybe start my own moving company. American dream stuff, you know? My buddy Jake thought I was crazy, but I figure if I could tough it out for a year or two, I'd have enough saved up to make something of myself. Now, Claire was this girl I'd been dating for about 6 months. We met at a Starbucks in West Hollywood. She was studying fashion merchandising at some fancy college, and I was grabbing coffee before a big job in the hills. She seemed cool at first, didn't judge me for the work clothes or the fact that I smelled like cardboard and sweat most days. But things started changing around month 4. She'd make these little comments about my job, like how I should maybe think about doing something more professional. At first, I brushed it off because, hey, everyone's got opinions, right? Plus, she was smart and pretty, and I figured maybe she was just looking out for me. The thing is, I actually liked my job. Sure, it was physical, and sometimes the customers were complete jerks, but there was something honest about it. You show up, you work hard, you get paid. No office politics, no fake smiles, just good old-fashioned labor. And the guys I worked with were solid people: Marcus, Tony, Big Jim. They had my back, and I had theirs. But Claire didn't see it that way. She'd always have some excuse when I'd ask her to hang out after work. Said she was studying or had plans with her fashion school friends, or just wasn't feeling well. I started noticing she never wanted to be seen with me in public when I was in my work clothes. She'd always suggest we meet at her apartment or some quiet restaurant way off the beaten path. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in October. I'd had a particularly good day. Helped this elderly couple move their stuff to a smaller place, and they tipped me an extra $100 just for being careful with their antique furniture. I was feeling great, so I decided to surprise Claire with dinner. I picked up some Thai food from this place she liked and drove my van to her apartment complex. Nothing fancy. Just wanted to share a meal and maybe watch Netflix or something. When I knocked on her door, she opened it but didn't invite me in right away. She just stood there in the doorway, looking at me like I was some kind of problem she needed to solve. That's when she said it. She looked me dead in the eye and told me she was ashamed of me, ashamed of who I was. Said she couldn't keep pretending like we were a good match when I was just a guy who moved boxes for a living. She said her friends were all dating guys with real careers, finance bros, marketing executives, guys in tech. And here she was with someone who showed up to dates with dirt under his fingernails. I just stood there holding that bag of pad thai, trying to process what she just said. Part of me wanted to argue, to tell her that honest work was nothing to be ashamed of, but another part of me felt this weird sense of relief, like I'd been waiting for the other shoe to drop for months. So I didn't say anything. I just handed her the food, turned around, and walked back to my van. She called after me, something about how we could still be friends or whatever, but I was already done. I drove to the parking lot behind a 24-hour diner and just sat there for a while, thinking about everything. That night, I slept in my van parked outside this massive house in Beverly Hills. We had a job there the next morning, some kind of state cleanout after the previous tenant got evicted. The paperwork said it was an elderly French woman who'd been living there for decades. Apparently, she used to work in fashion back in the day, but I didn't really pay attention to details like that. I was too busy feeling sorry for myself. Looking back now, I realized I should have seen the signs earlier. Claire had been pulling away for weeks, maybe even months. She'd stopped texting me good morning messages, stopped asking about my day, stopped doing all those little things that made me feel like I mattered to someone. But I was so focused on my own goals and trying to make our relationship work that I missed the obvious. The worst part wasn't even what she said, it was how she said it. Like she'd been thinking about it for a long time, rehearsing the words in her head. There was no emotion in her voice, no regret, just this cold, matter-of-fact delivery that made me feel like I was getting fired from a job I didn't even know I was bad at. I kept thinking about my dad that night. He'd worked construction his whole life. Came home every day covered in dust and concrete, hands rough as sandpaper. But he provided for our family, put food on the table, helped me buy my first car. My mom never once made him feel ashamed of who he was or what he did for a living. That's when I knew Claire and I were fundamentally different people. As I sat in that van, I made myself a promise. I wasn't going to let her words define me or make me feel less than. I was going to keep working hard, keep saving money, and prove to myself that I was worth something, not because of what I did for work, but because of who I was as a person. The next morning, I woke up early and grabbed coffee from a gas station. The house we were supposed to clean out was this massive Tudor-style mansion with ivy growing up the walls and a circular driveway. The kind of place that probably cost more than most people make in a lifetime. I'd seen plenty of houses like this in Beverly Hills, but this one felt different somehow. My supervisor, Carlos, handed me the paperwork and explained the situation. The tenant, an elderly French woman named Jacqueline, had been living there for over 30 years but got behind on rent during the pandemic. The landlord finally got the eviction order, and now we had to clear everything out before the new tenants moved in next week. But sometimes life has a funny way of working out. Sometimes the thing that breaks your heart ends up being the thing that changes everything. And that old French woman's house? Well, that's where this story really begins. Because the next morning, I found something that would make Claire's words seem like the best thing that ever happened to me. I just didn't know it yet. The next morning hit me like a slap of cold air. I'd barely slept, tossing and turning in the back of my van while replaying Claire's words over and over. But work was work, and I had bills to pay. So I grabbed my coffee and headed to the job site. The mansion looked even more impressive in the daylight. 3 stories, probably 8 bedrooms, with these massive windows that must have cost more than my van. Carlos was already there with the rest of the crew, Marcus, Tony, and this new guy named Derek who never stopped complaining about everything. Walking into that house was like stepping into a time capsule. Everything was elegant but old-fashioned heavy curtains, antique furniture, oil paintings, and gold frames. The kind of stuff you see in movies about rich people from the 1980s. It smelled like lavender and old books, with just a hint of something expensive I couldn't quite place. We started in the living room, wrapping up dishes and glassware. Most of it was headed straight to the donation truck, but Carlos told us to be careful anyway. You never know what might be valuable, and the company had a policy about treating client property with respect, even during evictions. The weird thing was how personal everything felt. There were photos everywhere. This elegant French woman at fashion shows, standing next to models and designers I didn't recognize. She looked like she'd lived an interesting life, traveled the world, been somebody important. Now, all her stuff was getting boxed up and hauled away by guys like us. Around noon, we moved to the bedroom. That's where Derek found the purse. He was going through this massive walk-in closet, pulling out clothes and accessories, when he grabbed this beat-up leather handbag from the top shelf. The thing looked ancient worn brown leather, tarnished brass hardware, and a shape that seemed familiar but old-fashioned. Derek held it up and started laughing. He said it looked like something his grandmother would carry to church, all worn out and probably smelling like old lady perfume. The way he was handling it, tossing it around like it was garbage, made me uncomfortable. Call it respect for the elderly or whatever, but it just felt wrong. I asked him to hand it over, told him I'd take care of it. Derek just shrugged and tossed it my way, making some joke about how I collected junk anyway since I lived in a van. The other guys laughed, but I ignored them. I'd gotten used to jokes about my living situation. The purse was heavier than I expected, and the leather felt expensive despite being worn. There was something about the craftsmanship that caught my attention, the way the seams were perfectly straight, how the hardware was still solid after all these years. I'd moved enough rich people's stuff to recognize quality when I saw it. I tossed it in the back of my van, thinking maybe I'd clean it up and give it to my mom for her birthday. She always carried old purses to church, and this one looked like it might be her style. Plus, after the whole Claire situation, I figured I could use some good karma from doing something nice for someone who actually appreciated me. The rest of the day was pretty standard. We loaded furniture, boxed up books, and filled probably 6 donation trucks with stuff that was probably worth more than my annual salary. By evening, we were done, and the house looked completely empty except for the built-in fixtures. I didn't think about the purse again until 3 days later. I was hanging out with my buddy Marcus. Not the Marcus from work, but this guy I'd known since high school who worked at an antique restoration shop downtown. He was always buying and selling vintage stuff, had a good eye for valuable pieces. We were sitting in his garage, drinking beer and talking about life, when I remembered the purse in my van. I figured he might know if it was worth anything, or at least if it was nice enough to give to my mom. So I went out and grabbed it, brought it back to show him. The moment Marcus saw it, his whole demeanor changed. He stopped mid-sentence, put down his beer, and asked if he could examine it more closely. He turned it over in his hands, checking the seams, the hardware, even the smell. Then he got this look on his face that I'd never seen before. He told me he didn't want to get my hopes up, but the purse might be something special. The leather quality, the construction, the hardware, it all pointed to high-end craftsmanship from the 1980s. And the style looked familiar, like something he'd seen in fashion magazines from that era. But here's the thing that really got his attention. This wasn't a mass-produced bag. The stitching was too perfect, the leather too premium, and there were little details that suggested it was either a prototype or a very limited edition. He said bags like this weren't made for regular customers. They were made for fashion insiders, celebrities, or industry professionals. Marcus suggested we do some research before I did anything with it. He had contacts in the fashion world who might be able to tell us more about its history. I figured why not? It wasn't like I had anything else going on, and after Claire's situation, I could use a distraction. That night, I went back to my van feeling something I hadn't felt in days, curiosity, maybe even a little hope. I had no idea what we might discover, but for the first time since Claire dumped me, I was looking forward to something. Little did I know, that old purse was about to change my life in ways I never could have imagined. Marcus wasn't messing around when he said he had contacts in the fashion world. The next morning, he called me at 7 a.m. with the kind of excitement in his voice that made me think he'd either won the lottery or discovered alien life. He'd spent half the night researching the purse, and what he found was pretty incredible. The style matched something called a Birkin bag, apparently one of the most exclusive handbags in the world, made by some French company called Hermès. But here's where it got interesting. The bag I found was way older than the official Birkin line, which didn't launch until 1984. Marcus had contacted this fashion historian in New York, a woman named Dr. Patricia Mills, who specialized in luxury accessories from the 1980s. She wanted to see detailed photos of the bag, especially any markings or serial numbers. So we spent the morning photographing every inch of that purse from every possible angle. When I really started examining it closely, I found some things I'd missed before. Inside the main compartment, there was an old French newspaper from July 1984, yellowed and brittle. And tucked into one of the side pockets was a small card with the initials JB written in elegant handwriting. But the real discovery was hidden under the main flap, in very small, barely visible lettering. Someone had engraved something into the leather. Prototype 01 JB. The engraving was so faint you had to hold it at just the right angle to see it, like it was meant to be a secret. Dr. Mills called us back within hours of receiving the photos. I could hear the excitement in her voice, even through Marcus's speakerphone. She said she'd been studying luxury fashion for 20 years, and she'd never seen anything like this bag outside of museum collections. According to her research, the Birkin bag was inspired by a chance encounter between an Hermès executive and actress Jane Birkin on a plane in the early 1980s. Jane had complained about not being able to find a practical but elegant handbag, and the executive promised to create something perfect for her. The bag I found appeared to be one of the original prototypes created during that development process. the newspaper date, the initials, the prototype marking. It all pointed to this being a piece of fashion history that was supposed to be lost forever. Dr. Mills said these prototypes were usually destroyed after the design was finalized, but sometimes they were given to the people who inspired them. In this case, it looked like Jane Birkin herself had owned this bag. I was trying to process all this information when Marcus dropped another bombshell. He'd done some digging into the French woman who'd been evicted from the mansion. Her name was Jacqueline Beaumont, and she'd worked as a fashion consultant in Paris during the 1980s. She'd been friends with several major designers and had moved to Los Angeles in the early 1990s. The pieces were starting to come together. Jacqueline had probably known Jane Birkin personally, maybe even worked with her on fashion projects. Somehow, she'd ended up with this prototype bag and had kept it all these years. Now, it was sitting in my van, having been literally thrown away by someone who didn't know what they were looking at. Dr. Mills wanted to authenticate the bag in person, but she was based in New York and couldn't travel to L.A. for another week. In the meantime, she suggested we contact Hermes directly to see if they had any records of the prototype. She warned us that if this was genuine, it could be worth more money than most people see in a lifetime. That's when reality hit me. Here I was, a guy who'd just been dumped for being a broke mover, potentially holding something worth millions of dollars. The irony wasn't lost on me. Claire had been ashamed of my job, but that same job had led me to probably the most valuable thing I'd ever touch. I started thinking about what I'd do with that kind of money. Pay off my van, get a real apartment, maybe start that moving company I'd been dreaming about. But first, I needed to know for sure what I was dealing with. Marcus offered to drive to New York with me to meet Dr. Mills in person. Before we left, I made a decision that probably sounds crazy. I called Claire, not to get back together or anything like that, but because part of me felt like she should know what had happened. Maybe it was petty, maybe I wanted to prove a point, but I felt like she deserved to hear how wrong she'd been about my life. The conversation didn't go the way I expected. When I told her about the bag, she got quiet for a long time. She asked if I was serious about the value. And when I told her what Dr. Mills had said, she went quiet again. Then she said she was proud of me for finding something so important. It felt hollow, like she was trying to insert herself back into my story now that it had got interesting. But you know what? I realized I didn't need her validation anymore. Whether that bag was worth $10 or $10 million, I'd found it because I was doing honest work and paying attention to the world around me. Claire had been so focused on being ashamed of what I did that she'd missed who I actually was. The next day, Marcus and I loaded up his car and started driving east. We had the bag locked in a security case in the trunk, and I had Dr. Mills' contact information programmed into my phone. Whatever happened next, I knew my life was about to change in ways I couldn't even imagine. As we drove through the desert toward Arizona, I found myself thinking about that French woman, Jacqueline. She'd lived with this treasure for decades, probably knowing exactly what was worth. And now, through a series of events that seemed almost impossible, it had ended up with me. Part of me wondered if she'd somehow known that the right person would find it when the time was right. The drive to New York took US 3 days, but it was worth every mile. Dr. Mills had arranged to meet us at a private authentication facility in Manhattan, the kind of place where they verify million-dollar artworks and historical artifacts. I'd never been anywhere that fancy in my life. The authentication process was intense. They photographed the bag under special lighting, analyzed the leather composition, and even tested the metal hardware to confirm it was made with materials available in 1984. Dr. Mills brought in 2 other experts, one from the Metropolitan Museum of Art and another from a luxury auction house. After 6 hours of examination, they delivered the verdict. The bag was authentic, a genuine prototype from the original Birkin development process, personally owned by Jane Birkin herself. The newspaper clipping, the initials, the prototype marking, everything checked out. I was holding a piece of fashion history that museums would kill to display. The next step was determining its value. Dr. Mills contacted Sotheby's auction house, and they sent their head of luxury goods to examine the bag. This guy had been in the business for 30 years and had handled some of the most expensive handbags ever sold. When he saw what we had, his eyes got wide. He explained that regular Birkin bags from the 1980s were already selling for hundreds of thousands of dollars at auction. But this wasn't a regular Birkin. This was the original, the one that started it all. He estimated it could sell for anywhere from $5 to $15 million, depending on how much publicity the auction generated. $15 million. I kept saying that number in my head, but it didn't feel real. A week ago, I was living in a van and getting dumped by my girlfriend for being a loser. Now I was potentially holding enough money to buy a mansion in Beverly Hills, maybe even the one where I'd found the bag. But the auction house guy suggested something different. Instead of a public auction, he recommended a private sale to a specific collector he knew, a tech billionaire who'd been trying to acquire the most important handbags in fashion history. This collector had unlimited resources and valued discretion above everything else. The private sale offer was incredible, $9.3 million cash, with the transaction completed within 48 hours. No publicity, no media attention, just a clean transfer of ownership. The collector wanted to keep the bag in his private museum, where it would be displayed alongside other iconic fashion pieces. I agreed to the deal. Marcus and I flew back to L.A. with a cashier's check for more money than I'd ever dreamed of having. The whole experience felt surreal, like I was living someone else's life. But as we sat in first class, drinking champagne and looking at that check, I knew everything was about to change. The first thing I did was call my parents. My dad cried when I told him I'd never have to worry about money again. My mom just kept asking if I was sure it was real, if someone wasn't playing an elaborate joke on me. But when I wired them enough money to pay off their mortgage and retire comfortably, they finally believed it. Then I got the call from Claire. Apparently, word had gotten out through mutual friends that I'd come into some serious money. She wanted to meet for coffee to talk about our relationship. Said she'd been doing some thinking about what really mattered in life. I almost laughed when she suggested we could start over, that maybe she'd been too hasty in her judgment. She talked about how she'd always believed in me, how she'd just been scared about our future together. It was like she was reading from a script written by someone who'd never met the real Claire. But here's where the story gets really interesting. The day after I got back from New York, I received a legal document in the mail. Claire had hired a lawyer and was claiming partial ownership of the bag. Her argument was that she'd been present when I brought it home, had given me advice about what to do with it, and was therefore entitled to a portion of the sale proceeds. The lawyer's letter was pretty aggressive, claiming that California's community property laws applied to our relationship even though we weren't married. They wanted 50% of the sale price, plus damages for emotional distress. I couldn't believe what I was reading. Fortunately, I'd used some of the money to hire my own lawyer, a really good one who specialized in high-value asset disputes. He looked at Claire's case and started laughing. Apparently, she made a crucial mistake in her legal strategy. See, my lawyer had obtained security footage from Claire's apartment building, which showed our breakup conversation. And in that footage, you could clearly hear her telling me to throw the bag away because it looked disgusting and probably smelled like old lady perfume. She literally told me to get rid of it. Even better, my lawyer had tracked down text messages between Claire and her friend from right after our breakup. In those messages, she specifically mentioned how glad she was to be free of her loser boyfriend who lived in a van and collected junk. She'd even joked about how I'd probably keep that ugly old purse as a souvenir. The judge threw out her case in about 10 minutes. Not only did she have no legal claim to the bag, but her own words proved she'd actively discouraged me from keeping it. The judge actually seemed annoyed that such a frivolous lawsuit had made it to his courtroom. After the hearing, Claire approached me in the hallway. She looked genuinely surprised that I'd fought her claim, like she'd expected me to just hand over a few $1 million because we'd dated. She said she couldn't believe I'd changed so much. That money had made me selfish and cruel. I told her I hadn't changed at all. I was the same person who'd worked hard, saved money, and treated people with respect. The only difference was that now I had enough money to protect myself from people who wanted to take advantage of me. She walked away without another word. Looking back, I realized the whole legal mess was actually a blessing in disguise. It showed me who Claire really was underneath all the education and fancy ambitions. She was someone who'd throw away a relationship over shame, then try to claim credit for my success when it suited her. But more importantly, it taught me that having money doesn't change who you are. It just reveals who you've always been. And who I'd always been was someone who valued honesty, hard work, and treating people fairly. No amount of money was going to change that. With the legal mess behind me and more money than I knew what to do with, I had to figure out what came next. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't have to worry about rent, car payments, or where my next meal was coming from. It was liberating and terrifying at the same time. I started by getting myself a real apartment. Nothing too fancy, just a decent 2-bedroom place in Santa Monica with a view of the ocean. After living in a van for 8 months, having a full-size bed and a kitchen felt like the height of luxury. I could finally cook real meals and take hot showers whenever I wanted. But the weird thing about having money is that it doesn't automatically make you happy. I'd solved all my financial problems overnight, but I still felt this emptiness where my sense of purpose used to be. I'd always been motivated by the need to work hard and build something better for myself. Now that I had everything I'd ever wanted, I wasn't sure what to do with my time. Marcus suggested I invest some money and live off the returns, maybe travel the world or buy a bunch of expensive toys. And for a while, I considered it. I could have bought a Ferrari, a yacht, or a house in the Hollywood Hills. But none of that stuff appealed to me. I'd never been motivated by material possessions, and having money didn't change that. Instead, I started thinking about what had actually made me happy during those months of living in my van. It wasn't the money I was saving or the dream of someday being rich. It was the satisfaction of doing honest work, helping people with their problems, and being part of a team that had each other's backs. That's when I got the idea for the foundation. I wanted to create something that would help young people who were in the same position I'd been in, working hard but struggling to get ahead, trying to build something meaningful with their lives. I called it the Second Chance Foundation, and the mission was simple: provide education, mentorship, and resources to help people achieve their goals. The foundation started small. I rented space in a converted warehouse in downtown LA and hired a small staff to help run programs. We offered vocational training, small business loans, and mentorship programs pairing young people with successful entrepreneurs. Marcus joined as my partner, bringing his expertise in restoration and antiques. One of our first programs was a workshop series teaching people how to identify valuable items at garage sales, estate sales, and thrift stores. It was partly inspired by my own experience with a Birkin bag, but mostly it was about teaching people to pay attention to the world around them and recognize opportunities when they appeared. We also started a scholarship program for students who were working their way through college, especially those in blue-collar jobs like moving, construction, or food service. I remember what it felt like to be exhausted after a 12-hour shift, but still have to study for exams or write papers. These kids deserve support, not shame. The foundation grew quickly. Within 6 months, we were helping hundreds of people across Los Angeles. Local news stations started covering our work, and other cities began asking us to expand our programs. I'd found my purpose again, and it felt better than any amount of money ever could. But the real test came about 8 months after the foundation launched. We were hosting our first annual fundraising gala at a hotel in Beverly Hills. Nothing too fancy, just a nice dinner where we could thank our supporters and share stories about the people we'd helped. I was standing near the bar, talking to a local business owner who donated money for our scholarship program, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. I turned around, and there was Claire. She looked great, professional dress, perfect makeup, confident smile. But there was something different in her eyes, something that looked almost desperate. She said she'd read about the foundation in the LA Times and wanted to congratulate me on all my success. She talked about how proud she was of what I'd accomplished, how she'd always known I was capable of great things. It was like she was trying to rewrite the history of our relationship. Then she asked if we could talk privately. We found a quiet corner of the hotel lobby, away from the noise of the party. That's when she said it. Asked if maybe we could start over, if there was a chance we could try again. She said she'd been thinking about us a lot, about how good we'd been together before everything went wrong. I looked at her and realized something important. She hadn't changed at all. She was still the same person who'd been ashamed of me when I was working as a mover, who'd only become interested again when I had money and success. She was attracted to what I'd become, not who I'd always been. I told her I appreciated her words, but I'd already started over. I'd built a new life, found a new purpose, and surrounded myself with people who valued hard work and integrity. I wasn't the same person she'd dated, not because of the money, but because I'd learned to respect myself. She looked confused, like she couldn't understand why I wasn't jumping at the chance to be with her again. She mentioned the foundation, my success, how we could be a power couple in LA's philanthropic scene. But that's when I knew for sure that she still didn't get it. I told her goodbye, not harshly, but firmly. I wished her well and walked back to the party. As I rejoined the crowd of people who were celebrating our foundation's work, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete peace with my choices. A few weeks later, I was cleaning out some old boxes when I found a photo of Claire and me from when we first started dating. We look happy, young, full of hope for the future. But looking at that picture, I realized that the future I'd actually built was better than anything I could have imagined back then. The foundation continued to grow, and I continued to find meaning in helping people who reminded me of my younger self. Marcus and I became successful business partners, and I started dating someone new, a teacher who worked with at-risk youth and understood the value of honest work. Sometimes I think about that old French woman, Jacqueline, and wonder if she somehow knew what would happen to her bag. Maybe she understood that it would find its way to someone who needed it, someone who would use it to build something meaningful. Or maybe I'm just being sentimental about a coincidence that changed my life. Either way, I'm grateful for every part of the journey. The hard work, the heartbreak, the incredible discovery, and even Claire's betrayal. All of it led me to exactly where I needed to be. And the best part? I never had to change who I was to get there.